Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malignant Young Puck dotting inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys for stopping by very much. As you guys do know, the day has finally come. We are in the Chessable Masters as part of the Meltwater Champions Chess Tour. I've been waiting on this tournament for, it seems like, forever. So I'm glad it's finally here. And I have the round one game for you between Alireza Firouzja and Wesley. And yeah, it's a nice game. It's a pretty roller coaster game. It's a really long game. So I'm gonna kind of like shoot through it. I'm not trying to keep y'all here. It is a 91 move game, 95 moves. So I do not want to keep you guys here for like 30 minutes. As always, for my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay, kamusta na, ingat lagi, magandang pon, magandang araw. Masaya ako Kitty King Muli. Let me see. Maraming salamat po sa nanunood ng aking mga video. Mabuting pagbati, ingat lagi. Appreciate you guys very much for always supporting and watching my stuff. Anybody who is coming from Iran, I will say salam and khayli mamnoon. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. And anybody else from around the world, I appreciate you guys for stopping by very much. Feel free to drop your language down in the comments, and I will make sure that if I don't already know it, which is a very great possibility, I will make sure I learn it so I can speak it to you next time. So if you guys are ready to go, without any further talking from yours truly, let's go ahead. Let me get this screen kind of, okay. Yeah. All right. Good. Let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have for this game. So we have e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop comes to b5. Knight to f6, so we do have the Berlin defense. So very solid defense. It's pretty hard to crack as white, but it is beatable. So we have castles by white. Knight takes e4, rook to e1. As you guys of course are familiar, I mean, this doesn't give away a pawn because you are going to be pinning some pieces against the king, so you are going to be getting your pawn back. So after the knight comes to d6, knight comes to e5. And, we do have bishop to e7. For those of you wondering why the knight doesn't just take, it is because of this nasty check right here. And you guys can see that this queen is attacked, and it doesn't matter if it goes to block because you have all of these pieces trained on this square. It is a pretty nasty situation. So don't, don't go taking bishops now. So the bishop comes back to f1. We have knight to f5, knight back to f3. We have d5, d4, castles. We got c3, bishop comes to d6, bishop to d3. So basically both sides are just trying to get, their pieces in good spots. They're trying to do some maneuvering and just kind of see what, novelty and newness that they can bring to the Berlin position. So rook comes to e8. We got g3, rook takes e1, knight takes e1. And this is going to be a very interesting move coming up in the future with this knight. Knight c to e7. We have knight to d2. We got c6, just trying to make sure that our pawn structure is solid. Knight d to f3. We have f6, and as promised, we have knight to g2. So we have a fianchetto knight on g2, and this isn't like normally where you see the knight, but I mean it has some influence on this square. So after you move bishop to f4, if you have an exchange, you're going to be improving the position of your knight. So it makes some sense. Plus, the position is somewhat closed, so I mean, you're going to be doing maneuvering and stuff like that. So, g6 comes as black, and then we do see the novelty of the game, which is queen to e2. You're just preparing, like I said, the bishop to be coming somewhere, and then the rook to probably be swinging over to e1, and just trying to maximize all your pieces. Knight comes back to g7, so it's interesting because we have a double fianchetto knight situation with these two knights, so it's pretty interesting look. That's not what the move is. I accidentally clicked that. Don't mind that. We do see bishop to f4. We have bishop to f5. So, I mean, black and white both kind of have the same idea with their knights and their bishops. Rook comes to e1. We have bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. It's crazy because this position by the computer is just saying it's just completely dead even. Both sides have a very similar type of structure. As you guys can see on the queen side, the pawns are exactly the same. They have a little bit of a difference in the way that the pawns are set up on the king side. But I mean, there's not a really huge opportunity for either side to really like make the greatest amount of progress, right? So knight E comes to F5. We have G4. Knight comes back to E7. We have queen to E3. King comes to F7. We have H4. Queen comes to D7. Bishop comes to D6. Now, there is an alarm going off. There's like a typical 12 o'clock Saturday alarm going off here. So hopefully it's not picked up very well in the video because it's pretty loud to me. But moving on, we have queen takes D6. Queen to H6. And this move can be kind of annoying as black because, you know, you are hitting this pawn and there really isn't a good way to defend it. You know, you can, you know, swing the rook over here, but you don't really just want your rook like in that defensive of a position. And plus, you know, you have like some possibilities of some pawns rolling and stuff. So king comes back to G8. We have H5. Rook comes to E8, which is a much better square for it. It's going to be on a half open file or an open file. Knight F comes to H4. We have G5. Knight comes back to F3. Knight back to C8. We have rook takes E8. Rook takes E8. And then we have a pretty explosive situation. Did I not get that in this whole thing? I didn't get a guess the move. I'm going to see if I could try to wing that. If not, I just won't have one. But maybe it could have been here. Anyway, knight takes G5. And it seems like a really explosive move. But guess what the computer says? Yes, you guessed it. Dead even. It's saying even though you took this pawn, you're sacrificing your knight, it's still dead super 1000% even. It's crazy how the computer thinks. So we do have queen to D7, just backing up. I mean, if we had a situation where the pawn took G5, I mean, that would still be fairly equal, but the queen would take on G5 with check. King probably would step to H8, and then you'd have queen to F5. And there is no good way to save this knight because checkmate is on F8, so you can't move the queen anywhere. And if you do happen to do this, you know, this is going to be really, this is going to be really Crimea River because the knight's gonna block, and then you have queen to F8 with check, and the only move is this, and you know, you're going to be dropping that knight anyway. So you're not really crying a river, but I mean, as you can see, you're going to get your piece back, and you know, you are just having an extra 2 pawns for that. So like I said, we did say queen to D7. Knight comes back to F3. Queen takes G4, and this is actually the first point in the game that things do start to kind of shift just a little bit. You know, so black has a pretty nice little advantage in this position. They have been able to snap them a pawn, but you're going to see coming up in a few moves like how the position looks better for black. So queen comes to E3. Knight C comes to D6. We have H6, king to F7, knight to H4, and then we have queen to G5. And you definitely don't want to go into this trade because the thing that you have to look at in the position is, yes, everything is equal, but these knights aren't as good as these knights because the black knights have much more scope. And also the king is much more active than this king. This king takes at least a couple of moves to get kind of more active into the center of the board. This king is already pretty much there. So if you do go into a trade, I mean, these knights, this knight especially has like the ability to come to one of these squares. And this knight also has the ability to maximize itself. And as you can see, I mean, this knight can kind of go here, but this knight isn't going really anywhere, and it's just kind of stuck on the edge of the board. So that's a major difference between the positions. So Firouzja says, hey, if we're going to go ahead and trade, we're going to trade on my terms. So he moves queen to F4, hoping that queen takes and then knight takes, and then you have the ability to get your knight into, like, you know, a little bit better position. So we have A5, A4, knight comes to C4, queen comes to B8, knight C to D6, queen to D8, queen takes H6. So you see another pawn has been snapped off the board. So you can really see like how the tide has really shifted for black. Queen to D7 with check. King comes up to F8. King comes to F1. Queen to G7, offering another trade again. Queen comes down to H3. Knight down to C4. So, you know, as you can see, like I said, I mean, this knight is improving its position and it's starting to try to, you know, attack some of these weaknesses that white has in their position. Knight comes to F4. Queen to F7. Knight to E6 with check. King comes to G8, knight to F5. And this is kind of sneaky because you definitely don't want to just capture here because you're going to be looking at check here. and there isn't a way for you to move your king closer to the queen, so that's just going to be dropping the queen for free. So we do see king to h8 in the position. Knight comes to h6, queen comes to g6, knight to f4, queen to e4. So as you can see, black is starting to get in a really nice position. This king doesn't really have a lot of places to go. It only has this pawn protecting him. The knight is going to be swinging down to d2 at some point. So we do have knight to f7 with check, king comes to g7, knight to d8, knight down to d2 with check, king steps over to g1, which is like the only move. Queen comes down to e1 with check. And it is suggested to go king to g2, but we actually see king to h2, and this allows the drop of another pawn. So queen takes f2 with check. Queen comes to g2 with check as well. So this is forcing the trade of queens. Queen takes g2, king takes g2, and now black is just up 2 clear pawns. Now it's not like absolutely 100% won, but black is very much in the complete driver's seat in this position. So the knight comes down to d6. So I'm going to go ahead and run through these. I have 2 different points I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to run through these moves pretty quickly because it's just kind of a lot of maneuvering, a lot of attacking and defending and stuff like that. But we have knight f to e6 with check. King comes to g6. Knight comes to c5. Knight 2 to c4. b3. And knight comes to d2. So now we're attacking this pawn. You have to be careful because b6 is going to kick your knight. You know, that's the only thing that's protecting the pawn. So we do have a push on b4. b6, knight comes to d7. We have b5. Pawn takes a5. Pawn takes a4. a6. Knight comes to c8 because we, you know, definitely have to make sure that pawn isn't going anywhere. Knight takes c6. a3. Knight comes to b4. Knight to e4. Knight to a2. h5, knight to b8, and knight to a7. And this is something else I wanted to talk about. You know, these pawns are completely passed, so these knights are blockading them. You know, any piece has the ability to blockade a pawn, but the best blockader of a pawn is a knight. So that is just something to keep in mind. If you're choosing between multiple pieces, you're going to want to go ahead and use your knight. It's just going to be more effective. You know, it jumps around, so it doesn't restrict its movement as much as other pieces do. So knight comes to d7. We see knight to c8. Knight to b8, king to f5, knight comes to c6. We see king to e6. We got a7, knight to b6. You know, we have to, of course, protect that queening square. Knight c to b4, knight to d6, king to h3. We have knight to b5, knight down to c2. We have king to f5. And this is where, like, Wesley So gets very, very accurate. And it's pretty impressive to see the computer say, hey, this is the move, and he makes the moves. So c4 comes. We have knight takes a7, pawn takes d5, knight back down to b5. So not immediately taking this pawn right here. Just, you know, accurately moving knight to b5. We have d6, and then king comes to g5. And these are all top computer moves. So, you know, like I said, it's looking really nice for So here. Knight a to b4. We have f5, and you know, as you guys can see, there's nothing stopping these pawns really from kind of rolling down the board. So it's pretty overwhelming for white. King comes to h2. We have f4. Knight to d5. Knight to d7, blockading the pawn again. Knight comes to c7. And of course, you don't want to go into this trade because you're going to be looking at a knight. I guess it's possible to go here, but this pawn is rolling. And this knight is doing a good job of holding this pawn. And plus this king is able to step over. So that's not the best possible scenario. So we do have knight takes d6. Knight takes a3. So now we have the issue solved on the queen side. King comes to g4. Knight to d5. King to knight to f5. Knight down to c2. King to f3. Knight to c3. Knight to f6. d5. King to g4. We have knight to e1. h4. Knight to d3. f3, king to g1, king to g3, knight to f2, and then we do have a knight to d4. And unfortunately, this is a blunder. This basically throws the win away, unfortunately. So if you do want to take a moment to pause the video and see how white takes advantage of this blunder, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So unfortunately, this puts this knight and this king on the same like knight jump. So either one of these knights has the ability to now jump into e4. So if you guessed knight c to e4 or knight f to e4, you would be absolutely correct. And in this particular case, the way that Wesley So goes, he just drops a complete piece. But we get into an endgame that is unwinnable. Going forward, we have knight f to e4 with check. King comes to f4. Knight takes f6. Knight to e2. King to f2. King to e5. Of course, we cannot take here because this pawn is just literally going to run down the board. So king has to come to e5. Knight to g4 with check. King to d6. Knight takes e2. Pawn takes e2. King takes e2. King takes d5. King to f3. h3. King to g3. h2. King takes h2. And it is in this position that the players have drawn the game. And it is because, of course, as you guys know, you cannot checkmate with a knight and a king by itself. That is not enough material. The only other alternative after we saw knight takes e4. It's not the only other alternative, but it's just one of the other main alternatives, is actually to take the knight here on e4 instead of moving king to f4. And then after knight takes e4, king comes to f4, knight down to d2. We see king to e3, and we're not worried about the knight because we're pushing the pawn. The pawn goes to d6, king takes d2, king to f2, and now you have a very interesting dilemma because this knight is the only piece that can make sure that this pawn doesn't promote, but it is also holding this pawn. So this king is going to have the ability to take both of these pawns. If you do so happen to push h3, d7 is going to come, and you have to either go to e6 or c6 with your knight, the king is going to take f3, knight to e5 with check, king to g3. And you see that there's nothing preventing the taking of this pawn at some point. And so that is going to be a draw. So this ends up being a draw multiple different ways. So yes, it's disappointing because Wesley So was like dominating at least the second half of that game. So that's unfortunate that he ends up with the draw. And Alireza Firouzja does get off the hook. Because this was such a crazy long game, I'm going to go ahead and skip my good mornings for next time. But I appreciate you guys very much. Khayli Mamnoon for anybody coming from Iran. And Makita Tayo Mamaya to my people in the Philippines. And I'll see y'all next time.